The Arizona sky blazed like a furnace, casting long shadows across the desert as the sun dipped behind the Superstition Mountains. Eleanor Davis pushed the creaking wheelbarrow along the dusty trail, her twin daughters nestled among blankets, their tiny faces flushed from the heat. Perched atop a small crate was a magnificent copper-feathered rooster, its once bright comb drooping slightly in the evening heat, the last connection to her father's farm and perhaps their only chance at salvation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Pine Shadow Ranch appeared before her like a mirage, a sprawling single-story adobe house with a weathered barn and corrals stretching into the distance. To most, it might have seemed modest, but to Eleanor, exhausted and desperate, it represented her final hope after weeks of hardship. "Hello?" she called, her voice thin against the vastness of the desert. The wheelbarrow's wheel caught on a stone, nearly toppling her precious cargo. "Is anyone here?" The ranch house door swung open with a creak. A man stepped onto the porch, silhouetted against the warm light spilling from inside. Cole Townsend stood tall and unyielding, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, eyes sharp as flint beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. Lines etched by sun and hardship marked a face that hadn't smiled in years. "We don't take in drifters, ma'am," he said, voice rough as the desert itself. "Town's another 15 miles east." Eleanor straightened her back despite the exhaustion threatening to buckle her knees. Her cotton dress, once blue, had faded to the color of the endless sky above, dusty and worn like her spirit but not yet broken. "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Townsend," she replied, chin lifted in defiance of her circumstances. "I'm looking for work." A skeptical eyebrow raised as his gaze traveled from her face to the sleeping twins in the wheelbarrow, then to the rooster watching him with one wary eye. "With 2 babies? And a chicken?" His disbelief was palpable in the cooling evening air. "What kind of work do you expect to do here?" "I can cook, clean, mend," she answered, her eyes never leaving his. "And this isn't just any chicken. Rusty here is the finest rooster in 3 counties. Champion bloodlines. He'll improve your flock tenfold." A short, sharp laugh escaped Cole's lips. "Is that so?" "It is." The words came out stronger than she felt. "My father was James Davis of the Copper Creek Farm. This rooster's sire won the state fair 3 years running." Something flickered across Cole's face, recognition perhaps or respect, before vanishing behind his stoic mask. The Davis name meant something even in these parts, known for quality livestock and honest dealings before drought had claimed the farm like so many others. "Davis taught his daughter about poultry, did he?" Cole asked, descending the porch steps slowly. "Everything I know," Eleanor confirmed. She didn't add that her father had died believing his knowledge had been wasted on a daughter instead of the sons he never had. Some truths were better left unspoken. Cole circled the wheelbarrow slowly, studying its contents with careful consideration. One of the twins stirred, small fingers reaching toward the fading light. Lucy, the more restless of the two, always first to wake. "This is no place for a woman alone," Cole said finally, "much less one with 2 little ones." Eleanor felt a flare of familiar frustration. "We've been alone since Tucson. We need a place to stay, just until I can earn enough to move on." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the desperation she fought to hide. "1 week. That's all I'm asking." Cole stepped closer, and in the fading light, Eleanor could see the hard lines of his face, carved by sun and wind and years of solitude. His eyes fell to the copper-feathered rooster, who puffed his chest and eyed the rancher with surprising boldness. "That's a copper black," he observed. "Rare breed these days." Eleanor nodded. "The last of my father's line. Rusty's worth more than everything else I own combined." Another long silence stretched between them, filled only with the distant call of a coyote and the whisper of wind through saguaro. The twins slept on, oblivious to how their fate hung in the balance of this moment. Finally, Cole spoke. "There's a room off the kitchen. It's small, but it'll fit you and the little ones." He gestured toward the barn with a slight nod. "Stay, if it crows at dawn." Eleanor blinked in confusion. "Pardon? Your rooster," Cole clarified, eyes unreadable in the gathering dusk. "If he's as fine as you claim, he'll crow at first light. That's your test. Roosters know good land, safe places. If he doesn't crow, you move on." Relief washed over Eleanor like a cool rain after months of drought. It was an odd condition, but one she could meet. Rusty had never failed to greet the dawn, not once since he'd hatched 2 years ago. "Thank you, Mr. Townsend." "Don't thank me yet." His eyes remained hard, guarded. Dawn comes early in these parts, and desert nights can silence even the boldest rooster. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the barn, leaving the house door open behind him, an invitation that felt more like a challenge. Eleanor took a deep breath and looked down at her daughter's peaceful faces. "It'll be all right, Lucy, Lily," she whispered. "We've found shelter for tonight, and tomorrow Rusty will crow for us." As she pushed the wheelbarrow toward the house, the last light of day caught on the small gold locket still hanging around her neck, a reminder of promises made and broken, of a past she couldn't escape and a future she couldn't yet see. Inside that locket were 2 tiny locks of hair, one from each girl, and the only photograph she had of Thomas, the husband who had left her with debts, twins, and a broken heart when consumption took him 6 months ago. Behind her, the Arizona dusk deepened to purple, and the first stars appeared in the vast sky above Pine Shadow Ranch, witnesses to a beginning none of them could have anticipated. The room off the kitchen was indeed small, but blessedly clean. A narrow bed pressed against one wall, a small washstand with a cracked mirror, and a rocking chair positioned near the room's only window. Better than anywhere they'd slept since leaving Tucson 3 weeks ago. Eleanor settled the twins on the bed, surrounding them with blankets to prevent them from rolling off. At 8 months old, they were becoming more mobile every day. Lucy, with her father's dark curls, and Lily, fair like Eleanor, were identical only in the determined glint in their eyes. After ensuring the girls were secure, Eleanor filled a small bowl with water and corn from her meager supplies and placed it near the window for Rusty. The rooster drank deeply, then settled on the windowsill, his copper feathers catching the lamplight. "You've never let me down before," she whispered, stroking his smooth feathers. "Don't you dare sleep through dawn tomorrow?" A soft knock at the door startled her. Cole stood in the doorway, a pitcher of milk and a plate with bread and dried meat in his hands. "Thought you might be hungry," he said gruffly, placing the food on the washstand. His eyes swept the room, taking in the twins on the bed and the rooster by the window. "Thank you." Eleanor's stomach rumbled at the sight of food, reminding her she hadn't eaten since morning. Cole lingered in the doorway, seeming to struggle with something unsaid. "Those little ones," he finally managed. "How old?" 8 months next Tuesday, Eleanor replied, moving to check on the girls, Lucy and Lily. He nodded once, his face unreadable. "There's extra blankets in the chest. Desert gets cold at night." Before she could thank him again, he was gone, boots echoing on the wooden floor as he retreated. Eleanor ate quickly, saving half the bread for morning, then settled into the rocking chair by the window. Outside, the desert had transformed in the darkness, silvered by moonlight, vast and mysterious. Somewhere out there, Cole Townsend was completing his evening chores, a solitary figure in this isolated landscape. What had brought him here? What kept him in this lonely place? The questions drifted through her mind as exhaustion pulled her toward sleep. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, Rusty's test. Eleanor must have dozed in the chair because she startled awake to the sound of the twins fussing. The moon had risen high, casting geometric shadows across the floor through the window. As she tended to the girls, a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night ran through her. What if Rusty didn't crow? The desert was an alien landscape to a rooster raised on a green Tennessee farm. What if the strangeness of this place silenced him? Where would they go? How would she protect her daughters with no money, no family, and no prospects? "Please," she whispered to whatever forces might be listening, "please let him crow." Outside, a coyote called to the moon, its lonely cry echoing across the empty spaces between stars. Eleanor drew the twins closer, humming softly until they drifted back to sleep. On the windowsill, Rusty slept with his head tucked beneath one wing, untroubled by the weight of responsibility he carried. Hours passed in the quiet darkness. Eleanor dozed fitfully, waking at every small sound. The settling of the house, the call of night birds, the distant lowing of cattle. When the eastern sky finally began to lighten, she was already awake, seated by the window, watching Rusty for any sign of stirring. "Come on," she urged quietly, careful not to wake the twins. "Wake up, Rusty." The rooster opened one eye, regarding her with what seemed like indifference before tucking his head back under his wing. "Don't you dare," Eleanor hissed, panic rising in her chest. "Don't you dare sleep through dawn. Not today." Outside, the landscape was transforming, darkness retreating as faint light touched the distant mountains. Any moment now, Cole would be rising, listening for the rooster's crow that would decide their fate. Eleanor gently nudged the rooster. "Please, Rusty. For the girls." The copper-feathered bird stretched, fluffed his feathers and hopped down from the windowsill to peck at the remaining corn in his bowl. But he remained silent as the light grew stronger. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Cole was up, moving through the house. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She cracked the window open, hoping the fresh air and brightening sky would inspire Rusty to perform his natural morning ritual. The rooster tilted his head, examining the desert dawn with curious eyes. He stretched his wings, puffed his chest, opened his beak, and remained silent. "No," Eleanor whispered, desperation clawing at her throat. "Please, no." The sound of boots approached her door. Cole, coming to check if the rooster had crowed. Coming to tell them they needed to leave. Tears stung Eleanor's eyes as she looked from the silent rooster to her sleeping daughters. "I won't beg," she told herself firmly, wiping away the moisture from her cheeks. "I'll find another way, another place." The footsteps stopped outside her door. Eleanor steeled herself for the knock, for Cole's voice telling her the deal was off. But the knock didn't come. Instead, she heard the front door open and close as Cole stepped outside into the early morning light. Through the window, she watched him cross the yard toward the barn, his tall figure silhouetted against the brightening sky. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own domain, unaware of the desperation mounting in the small room off his kitchen. "Rusty," Eleanor pleaded one last time, picking up the rooster and bringing him to the window. "Look at that beautiful sunrise. That's your cue." The rooster blinked at the fiery horizon, where the sun was just beginning to peak above the distant mountains, painting the sky in blazing oranges and pinks. For a moment he seemed to consider the sight, his head cocked to one side. Then, just as Cole reached the barn door, Rusty threw back his head and let loose a crow so loud, so triumphant, it seemed to shake the very glass of the window. The sound rang across the ranch yard, echoing off the buildings and racing across the desert like a proclamation. Cole stopped in his tracks, turning slowly toward the house. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the surprise on his face. Rusty, apparently pleased with himself, crowed again, louder this time if possible, as if making absolutely certain there could be no doubt about his fulfillment of the bargain. The twins woke at the noise, their startled cries mixing with the rooster's continued crowing. Eleanor laughed through her tears, gathering Lucy and Lily into her arms. "You magnificent bird," she said to Rusty, who strutted proudly along the windowsill. "You wonderful, stubborn creature." Outside, Cole still stood in the yard looking toward her window. After a moment, he raised his hand in what might have been acknowledgement or perhaps surrender. Then he continued to the barn, disappearing inside. They had passed the test. They could stay, at least for now. Eleanor hugged her daughters close, relief, flooding through her like a physical sensation. One hurdle overcome, though she suspected many more lay ahead. "We'll make this work," she promised the twins, who had already forgotten their rude awakening and were now happily grabbing at each other's hair. "Somehow, we'll make this work." As the sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, Eleanor prepared to face her first day at Pine Shadow Ranch, unaware of how completely this dusty, forgotten corner of the desert would transform her life and the life of the solitary rancher who had reluctantly opened his door. Cole found Eleanor in the kitchen just after sunrise, her daughters settled on a blanket in the corner, while she assessed the space with a practiced eye. The room was functional but neglected. A large cast-iron stove dominated one wall, shelves lined with mismatched dishes and dented cookware, a scarred wooden table pushed against the window. A kitchen built for utility, not comfort. "It's seen better days," Cole admitted, startling her with his sudden appearance. Eleanor turned, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Nothing that can't be remedied with some proper care." His eyes moved to the twins, who were contentedly examining a wooden spoon Eleanor had given them. "Your rooster has quite a set of lungs on him." "Rusty has never missed a dawn," she replied, unable to hide the pride in her voice. "My father always said a reliable rooster is worth his weight in gold." A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossed Cole's normally impassive face. "We'll see if his offspring are as punctual. I've got a dozen hens that could use some new bloodlines." Eleanor nodded, relief washing through her. This was an opening, a chance to prove her worth beyond a single morning's test. "I can help with that. I know breeding techniques that could improve your flock considerably." Cole studied her for a long moment. "You'll have your chance to prove that. In the meantime, there's work to be done." He gestured to the kitchen. "The last housekeeper left months ago. Place has been running wild since then." "I'll have it in shape within the week," Eleanor promised. "Today, I need to ride the east fence line. Had reports of coyotes getting to the chickens." He shifted uncomfortably. "Will you? Can you manage here? With the little ones?" Eleanor smiled at his awkward concern. "We've managed far worse than a dusty kitchen, Mr. Townsend." He nodded once, seemingly satisfied. "There's supplies in the pantry. Not much, but enough to work with." "I'll make do." Another nod, and he turned to leave. At the door he paused. "The hens will be in for lunch around noon. There's 4 of them. They're good men." Before Eleanor could respond, he was gone, boot heels echoing against the wooden floor. Through the window, she watched him stride toward the barn, his tall figure moving with purpose across the yard. Eleanor glanced at her daughters, who were now attempting to eat the wooden spoon. "Well, girls," she said, lifting them into her arms, "let's see what we can do with this kitchen." The day passed in a flurry of activity. Eleanor scrubbed years of grease from the stove, organized the chaotic pantry, and discovered that beneath the grime, the kitchen actually possessed a certain rustic charm. By mid-morning, she had bread rising on the counter and a pot of beans simmering on the stove, their rich aroma filling the previously stale air. Rusty had made himself at home in the chicken yard, where he strutted proudly among the hens, apparently pleased with his new domain. The twins napped and played alternately on their blanket, seemingly content with this new, stable environment. When noon approached, Eleanor heard the sound of men's voices and boots on the porch. She straightened her hair, checked on the twins once more, and stood ready to meet the ranch hands. The first through the door was an older man with silver hair and a weathered face, followed by 3 younger men, all dusty from morning work. They stopped short at the sight of her, clearly surprised by her presence. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt, "lunch is ready if you'd like to wash up." The older man recovered first, removing his hat. "Ma'am." Didn't know Cole had hired help. His eyes moved to the twins on their blanket. "Or that we'd be having such young company." "Eleanor Davis," she introduced herself, "and my daughters, Lucy and Lily." "Sam Holloway," the older man replied. "Foreman here at Pine Shadow for 30 years, he gestured to the others. "This is Miguel, Theo, and Jason." The men nodded respectfully, moving to the wash basin by the back door. "Cole mentioned you'd be coming in for lunch," Eleanor said, placing a loaf of fresh bread on the table. "I hope beans and cornbread will suffice for today. I'll have a better sense of supplies after this." Sam's eyebrows rose as he inhaled the aroma of fresh bread. "That's already more than we've had in months, ma'am. We've been surviving on Miguel's cooking, and while he's a fine hand with horses, his biscuits could break a tooth." The young man called Miguel grinned good-naturedly. "It's true. My grandmother would be ashamed." The tension broke, and soon the men were seated at the table, passing around plates of food, their initial wariness giving way to appreciation as they tasted Eleanor's cooking. This bread, Jason, the youngest of the group, closed his eyes in bliss. "I haven't had bread like this since I left home." Eleanor smiled, pleased by their reaction. As they ate, she learned more about Pine Shadow Ranch. 5,000 acres of mostly desert land, running a modest herd of cattle adapted to the harsh conditions, and maintaining a small but previously renowned breeding program for desert-hardy chickens. Cole's father was known for those birds, Sam explained, accepting a second helping of beans. Had customers from as far as California coming for his stock, but since the old man passed 5 years back, Cole hasn't had the heart to keep it up properly. The drought didn't help neither, Theo added. 3 bad years in a row. A lot of folks gave up and moved on. "But not Mr. Townsend," Eleanor observed. Sam shook his head. "Townsends have been on this land for 4 generations. Cole would sooner cut off his right arm than leave it." Eleanor nodded, understanding the kind of stubborn determination that kept a person rooted to a place despite all logic suggesting otherwise. Hadn't her father been the same? Staying on their failing Tennessee farm until his dying day, refusing to consider any other path? "Your little ones are mighty well behaved," Miguel commented, making a silly face at Lucy, who giggled in response. "They've had to be," Eleanor replied simply. No need to explain the hardships that had taught her daughters to adapt to difficult circumstances so young. As the men finished their meal, Sam lingered at the table while the others returned to work. "Cole didn't mention how long you'd be staying," he said carefully. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "That hasn't been determined yet." The old foreman nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I'll say this much. It's good to have decent food again, and those little girls bring some life to this place." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. Pine Shadow's been too quiet for too long. After the men left, Eleanor cleaned the kitchen and checked on Rusty, who had already established himself as the undisputed ruler of the chicken yard. The hens followed him adoringly, and Eleanor couldn't help but smile at his proud strut. "At least one of us is settling in nicely," she murmured. The afternoon stretched before her, and with the kitchen now in reasonable order, Eleanor decided to explore the rest of the house. With the twins balanced on her hips, she moved through the rooms, taking inventory of what needed attention. The house was larger than it had appeared from outside, with the central living area dominated by a stone fireplace, Cole's bedroom and office on one side, and 2 unused bedrooms on the other. Everything was functional but sparse, lacking any feminine touch or personal items. No photographs, no decorative objects, nothing to suggest the house was more than simply a place to eat and sleep. In one of the empty bedrooms, Eleanor discovered a cedar chest pushed against the wall. Curiosity overcame her sense of propriety, and she carefully opened it. Inside were quilts, lovingly made but long unused, and beneath them, a small collection of women's items, a silver-backed hairbrush, a faded ribbon, a small jewelry box. Eleanor closed the chest quickly, feeling like an intruder. These weren't random items. They had belonged to someone who was no longer here. A sound at the doorway made her turn guiltily. Cole stood there, his expression unreadable as he looked from her to the chest and back again. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quickly. "I was just taking inventory of what might need cleaning." "My mother's things," Cole said after a moment. "She died when I was 15. Father never had the heart to get rid of them." Eleanor nodded, understanding flooding her. "I'll make sure they're properly cared for." Something in Cole's face softened slightly. "The men said lunch was good." "High praise from hungry cowboys," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "Sam thinks you should stay." Cole's directness caught her off guard. "Says the little ones bring life to the place." Eleanor watched him carefully, trying to read his thoughts behind that stoic exterior. "And what do you think, Mr. Townsend?" Cole's eyes moved to the twins, who were now attempting to crawl in opposite directions on the wooden floor. I think you've passed one test. There'll be more. Without further explanation, he turned and left, boots echoing down the hallway. Eleanor sighed, gathering her daughters close. Well, girls, seems we've got a chance to prove ourselves. That evening, after serving a simple but hearty dinner to Cole and the hands, Eleanor sat on the small porch outside the kitchen, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The twins were finally asleep after a day of exploration, and she allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection. The sound of boots on gravel announced Cole's approach. He carried a small wooden crate, which he set down beside her chair. Thought these might be useful, he said, gesturing to the crate. Inside were baby items, small blankets, wooden toys, even a pair of tiny boots that looked unworn. Eleanor looked up in surprise. Where did these come from? Cole's gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Sam's daughter left them when she moved to Phoenix last year. Her boy outgrew them. Thank you, Eleanor said softly, touched by the unexpected gesture. The girls will love these. Cole nodded once, then added, There's a mare in the barn. Gentle old thing, doesn't get much use these days. If you want to exercise her sometimes, give yourself a break from the house. That would be acceptable. Eleanor recognized the offer for what it was. Not just permission to ride, but an acknowledgement that she might need moments away from her duties. Moments for herself. I'd like that, she replied. It's been a while since I've ridden, but I miss it. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence as darkness crept across the land and stars began to emerge in the vast sky. The desert night was alive with sounds. The rustle of creatures in the brush, the distant call of coyotes, the soft nickering of horses in the barn. Why here? Eleanor asked finally. Most people would have given up on this land years ago. Cole was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, reflective. My great-grandfather came here with nothing but a wagon and a dream. Everyone told him he was a fool, that nothing would grow in this desert. But he found water where others saw only dust, possibility where others saw only hardship. He gestured to the expanse of land before them. This place has been written off more times than I can count. But it's still here, still standing. The simple pride in his voice moved something in Eleanor. Here was a man defined by his connection to this harsh land, just as she had been shaped by her own losses and journeys. Your father, Cole said after another lengthy silence. The chicken breeder. He taught you well. He taught me everything he knew, Eleanor replied, even though he always wished for sons instead. Cole turned to look at her then. Really look at her, perhaps for the first time. His loss, I'd say. The compliment, simple as it was, warmed Eleanor more than it should have. Thank you for today, she said, rising from her chair. For giving us a chance. Cole stood as well, towering beside her in the darkness. Dawn comes early, he said. His standard farewell, it seemed. And Rusty will be ready, Eleanor replied with a small smile. Something that might have been amusement flickered in Cole's eyes before he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the ranch yard. In the days that followed, Eleanor and the twins settled into the rhythm of life at Pine Shadow. The kitchen became her domain, transformed from a neglected space to the heart of the ranch house. Herbs dried from the rafters, the scent of fresh bread was a constant, and Emma's improvised cradle now occupied a corner near the warm stove. The ranch hands, initially wary of the woman and children in their midst, had been won over by Eleanor's cooking and quiet determination. Even gruff old Sam had taken to removing his hat when entering the kitchen, and occasionally bringing desert wildflowers for the little Miss's education. On this particular Sunday afternoon, Eleanor stood at the chicken yard fence, watching as Rusty presided over his growing harem. In just weeks, the rooster had transformed the previously lackluster flock. The hens looked healthier, more vibrant, and already there were signs that egg production was improving. You've worked wonders with those birds, Cole's voice came from behind her. Eleanor turned, smiling. Rusty deserves the credit. I just make sure they're fed properly." Cole moved to stand beside her at the fence, closer than his usual careful distance. "Sam says egg production is up nearly 30%. A good diet makes all the difference," Eleanor explained. "The mixture of seeds and insects I've been providing is closer to what they'd forage naturally." Cole nodded, watching the chickens with newfound interest. "My father would have appreciated your methods." "High praise," Eleanor replied, recognizing the compliment for what it was. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Rusty shepherd his flock with comical dignity. In 3 weeks, the copper-feathered rooster had become something of a ranch mascot, his morning crow now the official start to each day at Pine Shadow. "The Harvest Festival is next Saturday in Copper Springs," Cole said unexpectedly. "Thought you and the little ones might want to come along. Get a change of scenery." The invitation surprised Eleanor. In nearly a month, she had not left the boundaries of Pine Shadow, partly from fear of the unknown beyond its borders, partly from the comfort of the sanctuary she'd found here. "I don't know if that's wise," she said carefully, her eyes dropping to where the twins were napping in the shade of a mesquite tree. Cole studied her, that penetrating gaze that seemed to see more than Eleanor sometimes wanted to reveal. "You're still worried he'll find you." It wasn't a question. Somehow, over shared meals and quiet evenings on the porch, Cole had pieced together fragments of her story. Not everything. Eleanor kept the darkest parts locked away, but enough to understand she was running from something, someone. "Thomas's brother," Eleanor admitted quietly. "When Thomas died, Richard claimed I was responsible, that I hadn't cared for him properly during his illness. He said I wasn't fit to raise the girls, that they'd be better off with him and his wife." Her arms instinctively tightened around herself as if protecting against a blow. "He's a powerful man in Tucson. When the judge seemed inclined to consider his petition for guardianship, I took the girls and left in the night." Cole's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the weathered skin. "No one's taking those children from you, Eleanor. Not while you're under my roof." The fierce certainty in his voice made something flutter in her chest, something dangerous and hopeful that she'd thought long dead after Thomas's betrayals and Richard's cruelty. "Besides," Cole continued, his tone lightening slightly, "everyone in 3 counties will be at the festival. Might do you good to hear some music, see some friendly faces that aren't covered in dust and smelling of cattle." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "All right, we'll come." Later that evening, after the twins were settled for the night, Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the star-scattered sky above the ranch. Below, she could see Cole on the porch, pipe smoke curling above his head as he sat in contemplative silence. 4 weeks ago, he had been a stranger offering conditional shelter based on a rooster's crow. Now he was, what? Employer, certainly. Protector, perhaps. And something else, something unnamed that made her heart beat faster when their hands accidentally touched while passing dishes at the dinner table. Something dangerous for a widow with secrets and children to protect. As if sensing her thoughts, Cole looked up, meeting her gaze across the distance. He didn't smile. Cole Townsend rarely smiled, but he nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed more than words could have. Eleanor nodded back, then stepped away from the window, her reflection in the glass revealing cheeks flushed with color that had nothing to do with the desert heat. Tomorrow they would return to the regular rhythm of ranch life, the feeding and cleaning, cooking and mending that defined her days at Pine Shadow. But on Saturday they would venture beyond the ranch boundaries, and Eleanor would face the world she'd been hiding from these past months. The thought terrified her, but with Cole beside her, it terrified her a little less. Outside, the Arizona night deepened, coyotes singing in the hills and a gentle breeze stirring the mesquite trees. Inside, the twins slept peacefully, untroubled by the complexities of the adult world. And somewhere between fear and hope, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future where Pine Shadow wasn't just a temporary haven, but a place they could call home. The town of Copper Springs was celebrating with enthusiasm, American flags hanging from every storefront and bunting draped across the small bandstand in the center of the main street. Children chased each other with sparklers despite the morning hour, their laughter rising above the general bustle of the crowd. Eleanor sat stiffly on the wagon bench beside Cole, the twins secure in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs as they approached the gathering. 6 weeks of relative isolation had made the prospect of so many strangers overwhelming. "We won't stay long," Cole said quietly, as if sensing her discomfort. Just supplies and maybe lunch at Maggie's if you're feeling up to it. She nodded gratefully, adjusting her bonnet to better shield her face. An unnecessary precaution, perhaps, this far from Tucson, but one that gave her comfort. Cole guided the wagon to a hitching post near the general store, helping Eleanor down with a careful hand at her elbow. The twins, dressed in their best and only matching dresses, observed the colorful scene with wide-eyed fascination. "Mr. Townsend," a booming voice called. A round-faced man with an impressive mustache hurried toward them from the store's entrance. "Twice in 1 month! The desert must be freezing over!" "Mr. Sullivan." Cole nodded respectfully toward the store owner. "Need extra supplies today." Sullivan's curious gaze fell on Eleanor and the twins, his eyebrows rising in undisguised interest. "Well now, what have we here?" "You've been keeping secrets, Townsend." "This is Mrs. Davis," Cole replied, his tone neutral but firm. "My housekeeper and her daughters, Lucy and Lily." Something in the way he emphasized housekeeper silenced the speculation in Sullivan's eyes. The older man nodded respectfully toward Eleanor. "Ma'am, welcome to Copper Springs. Any friend of Cole's is a friend of ours." As Cole reviewed his supply list with Sullivan, Eleanor wandered the store, the twins balanced on each hip. They paused at a display of fabric, and Eleanor found herself drawn to a bolt of sunny yellow calico patterned with tiny white flowers. "That would suit you beautifully," came a female voice. Eleanor turned to find a woman about her own age smiling warmly at her. "Yellow to match those girls' blonde curls." The woman extended her hand. "Maggie Reynolds. I run the cafe down the street." Her eyes twinkled with friendly curiosity. "And you must be the mysterious woman who's got our Cole actually socializing again." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Eleanor Davis. And these are Lucy and Lily. I'm just Mr. Townsend's housekeeper." Maggie's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she tactfully changed the subject, cooing over the twins, who basked in the attention. "Will you be staying for the festivities? The band's coming all the way from Phoenix, and there's to be dancing after sundown." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion near the door drew their attention. A group of men had entered, trail dusty and loud, led by a man whose confident stride and expensive boots marked him as someone of importance. "Ladies," the man greeted, tipping his hat as he approached. His eyes lingered on Eleanor with open appreciation. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure. Victor Caldwell, Circle C Ranch," he continued, extending his hand. His smile revealed teeth too white and perfect to belong to a working rancher. "Mrs. Davis is with me, Caldwell." Cole's voice cut through the moment as he appeared at Eleanor's side, his presence solid and reassuring. Something shifted in Caldwell's expression. Surprise, followed by calculation. "Townsend, didn't take you for a family man. There's a lot you don't know about me." Cole's tone was mild, but Eleanor could sense the tension beneath it. "We need to be getting on with our business." Caldwell's gaze swept over Eleanor once more, lingering on the twins with an interest that made her instinctively hold them closer. "Of course. Perhaps I'll see you at the dancing later." With a tip of his hat, he rejoined his companions. Outside, as Cole loaded supplies into the wagon, Maggie appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "Don't mind Victor Caldwell," she said quietly. "He's been trying to buy out every small ranch in the county, including Pine Shadow. Cole's the only one still holding out." Eleanor glanced toward Caldwell, who was watching them from the store's porch with undisguised interest. "Why does he want the land so badly?" "Railroad's coming through next year," Maggie explained, lowering her voice. "The man who controls the water rights where they plan to build the depot will control everything." She nodded meaningfully. "And the best water in the county runs through the east pasture of Pine Shadow," Eleanor finished, remembering the clear spring where she'd taken the twins for a cooling splash during the hottest days of the past month. Maggie nodded. "Just be careful. Caldwell's not used to being denied what he wants, and he's got the money and connections to make life difficult for those who cross him." The warning followed Eleanor like a shadow as they made their way to Maggie's cafe for lunch. The festive sounds of the town celebration seemed suddenly hollow, undermined by the calculation she'd seen in Caldwell's eyes. Cole was unusually quiet, his profile set against the bright midday sky as strong and unyielding as the desert mesas themselves. The twins, oblivious to the tension, charmed everyone in the small cafe with their identical smiles and grabbing hands. "You never mentioned the railroad," Eleanor said finally, breaking the silence as they sat over coffee after their meal. Cole's hands tightened slightly around his cup. "Didn't seem important. Maggie says Caldwell wants your water rights, that he's buying all the neighboring ranches." A muscle worked in Cole's jaw. "Caldwell can want whatever he pleases. Pine Shadow isn't for sale." The fierce certainty in his voice stirred something in Eleanor. Admiration, yes, but also concern. She'd seen what powerful men did when denied what they wanted. "What if he doesn't take no for an answer?" Cole glanced at her then, his gray eyes softening as they took in her worried expression. "I've handled men like Victor Caldwell before, Eleanor. Pine Shadow has been in my family for 4 generations. I'm not about to be the Townsend who loses it." The conversation faded as they finished their meal and prepared to return to the ranch. Lucy and Lily, overwhelmed by the excitement and stimulation, were fussing for their nap. "We should head back," Eleanor suggested, gathering the twins. "They need rest, and we've got what we came for." Cole nodded, clearly relieved at the suggestion. "I'll get the wagon." As Eleanor waited with the twins outside the cafe, she became aware of being watched. Across the street, Victor Caldwell leaned against a hitching post, his gaze fixed on her with unsettling intensity. When he realized she'd noticed, he tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. A chill ran through Eleanor, despite the desert heat. There was something in Caldwell's expression that reminded her too much of Richard, the entitled confidence of a man used to taking what he wanted, regardless of who stood in his way. Cole returned with the wagon, his expression darkening as he followed Eleanor's gaze to Caldwell. Without comment, he helped her and the twins into the seat, then climbed up beside them, urging the horses into motion with unusual haste. As they left town behind, Eleanor felt herself gradually relaxing, the tension in her shoulders easing with each mile that separated them from Caldwell's calculating stare. The twins, lulled by the wagon's movement, drifted to sleep against her chest. "I shouldn't have brought you to town," Cole said abruptly, breaking the silence. "Shouldn't have exposed you and the little ones to Caldwell's attention." Eleanor shook her head. "You couldn't have known, and we can't hide at the ranch forever." The words surprised her as soon as they left her mouth. When had she started thinking of staying at Pine Shadow forever? Cole glanced at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "No," he agreed quietly. "I suppose we can't." They crested the final hill, Pine Shadow coming into view below them, the adobe house gleaming in the afternoon sun, the barn and corrals, the chicken yard where Rusty would be presiding over his domain. In the golden light, it looked like a painting, peaceful and permanent. But as they approached the ranch yard, it became clear something was wrong. Sam came running from the barn, his usually composed face tight with concern. "Riders, boss. 6 of them. By the tracks." Caldwell's men, by the look of it. They were nosing around the East Spring. "Left when they saw me watching. But I don't like it." Cole's expression darkened as he helped Eleanor and the still sleeping twins down from the wagon. "Get the men together, Sam. Double the watch tonight." That evening, after the twins were asleep in their room off the kitchen, Eleanor found Cole on the porch, rifle across his lap as he stared into the darkness beyond the yard. Without a word, she sat beside him, offering a cup of coffee, which he accepted with a nod of thanks. "You should take the girls and go to town tomorrow," he said after a long silence. "Stay with Maggie until this is settled." "Is that what you think I'd do?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Run at the first sign of trouble?" Cole turned to look at her, the moonlight silvering his features. "This isn't your fight, Eleanor. Isn't it?" She met his gaze steadily. "You gave us shelter when we had nowhere else to go. You've protected us, provided for us." "I've given you a job," he interrupted, though the roughness in his voice betrayed deeper emotions. Eleanor shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "We both know that's not true, Cole." Something vulnerable flashed across his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He stared out into the darkness, his profile strong against the star-filled sky. "I lost my wife and son to fever 12 years ago," he said finally, the words emerging as if pulled from somewhere deep and painful. Maria was from Sonora. Beautiful, strong, fearless. Our boy, Daniel, was just 4. His voice caught slightly. I swore I'd never put myself in a position to lose anyone like that again. Understanding bloomed in Eleanor's heart, pieces falling into place. The untouched rooms, the cedar chest of women's belongings, the small boots he'd given her for the twins. So you built fences, she said softly, not just around your land, but around your heart. Seems safer that way. Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers cool against his calloused palm. Safe isn't the same as living, Cole. He didn't pull away, and for a long moment they sat together in silence, connected by that simple touch and all the unspoken feelings it conveyed. Caldwell will be back, Cole said finally. Men like him don't give up easily. Then we'll face him together, Eleanor replied, the word hanging in the air between them like a promise. Lucy, Lily, and I aren't running anymore. The days that followed were tense with anticipation. Ranch hands rode in pairs, always armed, watching the boundaries of Pine Shadow with vigilant eyes. Cole spent long hours in consultation with Sam, planning for every contingency. Caldwell's ultimatum arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a nervous young man who refused to meet Cole's eyes. A formally worded letter offering to buy the ranch for a sum that would have tempted many men. Cole read it once at the kitchen table, then handed it to Eleanor without comment. The amount was staggering, enough to start fresh anywhere, to provide security for the twins, to rebuild a life without fear. It's a generous offer, she said carefully, watching his face. Blood money, Cole replied, his jaw set. He knows I won't sell. This is just the opening move. Eleanor studied him across the table. This man who had become so much more than an employer in the 2 months since she'd arrived with her daughters and a copper-feathered rooster. What will you do? What Townsends have always done, he answered simply. Stand our ground. That night, Eleanor lay awake long after the twins had fallen asleep, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. Through the window, she could see the silhouettes of the men Cole had posted as sentries, moving occasionally against the star-filled sky. Her thoughts drifted to Richard, to the life she'd fled in Tucson. She'd been running for so long, from her father's disappointment, from Thomas's betrayal, from Richard's threats, always looking over her shoulder, always prepared to flee at the first sign of danger. But something had changed here at Pine Shadow. Perhaps it was the quiet strength Cole embodied, or the sense of belonging she'd found among these rough but honest people. Perhaps it was simply time, the gradual healing of old wounds in this harsh but beautiful landscape. Whatever the reason, Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that she was tired of running, tired of living in fear. If Caldwell came for Pine Shadow, she would stand beside Cole, not because he needed her help, but because this place, these people, had become worth fighting for. With that resolution firm in her mind, she finally drifted to sleep, one hand resting protectively on the twins, the other curled around the small gold locket that contained all that remained of her past life. The attack came at dawn 3 days later, just as Rusty's crow announced the new day. Eleanor was already awake, preparing breakfast for the ranch hands, when she heard the pounding of hooves in the yard. Through the kitchen window, she saw Cole and his men mounting up, rifles ready, heading toward the east pasture where a cloud of dust betrayed the approach of riders. Stay inside, Sam called to her as he passed the kitchen. Keep the little ones close. Eleanor nodded, gathering the twins from their makeshift cradle and retreating to her room. Through the small window, she could see the confrontation unfolding in the distance. Cole and his 4 men facing at least a dozen riders led by the unmistakable figure of Victor Caldwell. The men were too far away for her to hear their exchange, but the tension was visible even at this distance. Caldwell gestured expansively, likely repeating his offer. Cole sat motionless on his horse, his refusal evident in every line of his body. For a moment it seemed the standoff would end there, with Caldwell accepting defeat, at least for the day. The riders began to turn away, heading back toward town. Then, so quickly Eleanor almost missed it, One of Caldwell's men struck a match and tossed it into the dry brush near the spring. A small flame caught, grew, and began to spread, driven by the morning breeze. "No!" Eleanor gasped, watching in horror as the fire took hold. The east pasture was bone dry after weeks without rain, perfect tinder for a blaze that could quickly grow beyond control. Cole and his men immediately turned their attention to the fire, dismounting to beat at the flames with their jackets. But Caldwell's party used the distraction to circle around, cutting them off from the ranch house, trapping them between the advancing fire and the armed riders. Eleanor's mind raced. The fire was spreading quickly, and Cole's men were outnumbered and in a vulnerable position. Without help, they might lose not just the fight with Caldwell, but their lives to the growing blaze. The ranch house was deserted now, all hands having gone to join the confrontation. No one to send for help, no one to warn the men of the danger behind them. Eleanor looked at her daughters, peacefully playing on the bed, unaware of the crisis unfolding. To ride out would mean exposing them to danger, but to do nothing might mean watching Cole and his men perish. A flash of copper in the yard caught her eye. Rusty, strutting near the barn, his proud head held high as he surveyed his domain. In that moment, Eleanor made her decision. Moving quickly, she secured the twins in the cloth carrier she'd fashioned weeks ago, strapping them to her chest where they nestled against her, curious but content. Then she grabbed Cole's spare rifle from beside the door and hurried to the barn. Smoky, the gentle mare Cole had offered her for riding, whickered in greeting as Eleanor entered. With practiced movements that belied her years away from farm work, she bridled the horse and led her into the yard. "Hold tight, my loves," she whispered to the twins as she mounted, adjusting them securely against her. The mare danced nervously, sensing the tension in her rider. Rusty, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, crowed loudly from the yard, the sound echoing across the ranch like a battle cry. "Let's go, Smoky," Eleanor urged, turning the mare toward the east pasture and the rising column of smoke that marked the location of the confrontation. She rode hard across the desert, one arm supporting the twins, the other holding the reins, her heart pounding in rhythm with the horse's hooves against the dusty ground. As she crested the rise overlooking the spring, the scene before her sent a chill through her despite the heat. The fire had grown, forming a wall of flame that separated Cole and his men from escape. Caldwell and his riders had formed a semicircle, effectively trapping them against the advancing blaze. Eleanor could see Cole shouting to his men, organizing their defense, but they were badly outnumbered and in a desperate position. Without hesitation, she raised the rifle and fired into the air, the shot cracking across the landscape like thunder. All heads turned toward her, Cole's face registering shock and fear as he saw Eleanor and the twins exposed on the ridgeline, Caldwell showing calculation and then something like triumph. "Mrs. Davis," he called, loud enough for her to hear across the distance. "How convenient. Now we can settle all our business at once." Eleanor urged Smoky down the slope, the rifle held ready across her saddle. As she drew closer, she could see the surprise on the faces of Caldwell's men. Clearly, they hadn't expected resistance from this quarter. "The sheriff and a dozen men from town are right behind me," she called, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "They saw your men start the fire. Arson's a hanging offense in Arizona territory." It was a desperate bluff, but delivered with such conviction that several of Caldwell's men exchanged uneasy glances. "She's lying," Caldwell snapped, but doubt had been planted. Eleanor brought Smoky to a halt, positioning herself so that Cole could see her clearly. With deliberate movements, she pointed to the north, then to the space between Caldwell's men where a gap had formed in their line. Cole understood immediately. "Now!" he shouted to his men, and they charged through the opening, scattering Caldwell's riders who were momentarily distracted by Eleanor's arrival. In the confusion that followed, Cole reached Eleanor's side, his face a mixture of anger and relief. "Get back to the ranch," he ordered. "Now!" "The fire's spreading toward the house," she countered. "You're going to need every hand to stop it." Before he could argue further, one of Caldwell's men recovered his wits and raised his rifle, aiming directly at Cole. Without thinking, Eleanor swung her own weapon around and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to startle the man, his bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ground. The moment of direct threat broken the spell that had held Caldwell's men in place. Faced with armed resistance and the possibility of legal consequences, their resolve faltered. When Sam and Theo charged directly at them, they broke ranks and retreated, galloping back toward town with Caldwell shouting furiously after them. But the victory was short-lived. The fire, temporarily forgotten in the confrontation, had gained strength, racing across the dry pasture toward the ranch buildings. "The spring!" Cole shouted, already turning his horse. "If we can get ahead of it, use the water to create a break!" The next hours passed in a blur of smoke and desperate activity. Eleanor, having left the twins safely with Miguel at the ranch house, joined the bucket line at the spring, passing water to the men who fought to create a fire break ahead of the advancing flames. The heat was oppressive, the smoke stinging their eyes and throats as they worked. But gradually, inch by painful inch, they began to gain ground against the fire. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh light through the smoke-filled air, Eleanor found herself working alongside Cole, their movements synchronized in the desperate effort to save the ranch. "You could have been killed," he said during a brief pause to catch their breath, his voice rough with emotion. "You and the girls." Eleanor met his gaze steadily through the haze of smoke. "We're stronger than we look." Something changed in Cole's expression then. Recognition, perhaps, or acceptance of a truth he'd been fighting for too long. By mid-afternoon, the fire was contained, reduced to smoldering patches that the men methodically extinguished. Caldwell and his riders were long gone, their attempt to force Cole's hand having failed spectacularly. The east pasture was a blackened wasteland, but the spring itself was untouched, its clear water still flowing through the charred landscape. The ranch buildings, thanks to the fire break they'd established, stood unharmed. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Eleanor and Cole stood together on the ridge overlooking the damage. The land would recover. Already, Cole was speaking of the fresh growth that would come with the next rain. But something fundamental had changed between them, like the shifting of the earth beneath their feet. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.